Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming. I recognize that this is not the CBI with the sexiest title that has ever existed, but I hope to sort of demonstrate to you, at least by the end of this, that it's at least an important topic and maybe even perhaps an interesting topic as well. So the title of the talk and of the work that the talk is based on is called WellBeing Analysis versus CostBenefit Analysis. It is joint work with my co-authors John Bronstein and Chris Buckafusco. Richard McAdams was not actually involved in any of the preparation of the paper, but he created or helped create the PowerPoint slide template. And when he sent it to me, I joked that I would make him a co-author of all of my papers in which I used those PowerPoint slides. So I guess I took my own joke too seriously or something. So there it is. So if you don't like the paper or you don't like the idea, please don't blame Professor McAdams. Okay, so I'm going to start simply, and then we're going to sort of build from there. And I'm going to try to keep this relatively brief so we can have Q&A, which I think, which I'm eager to hear what you guys have to think about everything. So what is cost-benefit analysis? So most regulations, most laws, most policies that government enact involve trade-offs between various types of goods. They create some goods, they destroy other goods. So you can imagine, this is my sort of working example, which I'll use for the first 10 or 15 minutes. Workplace chromium regulation. Chromium is a chemical that's very dangerous if it's inhaled. And so a number of agencies, especially the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, have considered whether or not they should be banning harmful chromium compounds in the workplace. So what are the trade-offs? So you might imagine banning chromium compounds in the workplace will require the industries that use chromium compounds to pay, let's say, $300 million in compliance costs. Those compliance costs might be switching to a less hazardous type of chemical, or it might be buying protective equipment for their workers. And now everyone gets a gas mask, so they're not inhaling chromium. What are the benefits on the other side? Well, if we ban chromium in these various workplaces, we're going to save 5 lives and, let's say, prevent 20 cases of emphysema, which is a pretty unpleasant respiratory disease. So how do we weigh those things against one another? How do we determine whether it's worth effectively spending $300 million, making businesses pay $300 million to save 5 lives or prevent 20 cases of emphysema? Let me tell you the things we cannot say. The first thing we can't say is the lives are worth more. It's always worth more if you can save a life. Because the problem is then, well, what if you have a new regulation that will cost $1 billion and save 1 life? Or how about a regulation that costs $100 billion and saves 1 life? We can't expend all of society's resources to save 1 single life, in large part because those resources might be better spent somewhere else saving more lives. It might be that these $300 million in compliance costs could be used to save 50 lives somewhere else or 100 lives somewhere else. So if we squander them here, we'll have lost the chance to save other lives elsewhere. These are real life trade-offs. So it's more, you have to do more than just say, oh, the lives are worth more. The other thing we can't just say is, well, you can't put a price on life. These things are incommensurable. They can't be compared, so we can't price life. So it's, in fact, it's sort of repulsive to make this comparison of how much money and how many lives. There's real moral force to that way of thinking about things, but that's not how government operates. It's never how government has operated, and it can't be how government operates. We're always forced to make those types of trade-offs. We make those trade-offs in our own daily lives. We price our own lives all of the time when we decide what sorts of jobs we'll take or how fast we're going to drive or whether or not we're going to go see the doctor and that sort of thing. Government has to do exactly the same thing. It has to figure out whether it's worth spending a whole bunch of money to try to prevent people from getting emphysema or whether it's not worth doing so. At some level, we must be able to make these trade-offs. They are a part of our natural daily lives. We just have to figure out a way to make those trade-offs. So the solution is cost-benefit analysis. That's what regulatory agencies and policymakers and the government at large do. So what the cost-benefit analysis tells you to do is figure out a monetary value for the costs of your regulation and the benefits of your regulation. So in this case, figure out the monetary value of a life that you're going to be saving or a case of emphysema that you're going to be preventing. And add those monetary values up together. Those are the benefits you've generated from your regulation, and compare them to the cost of the regulation, the lives that you've lost. Okay, if the benefits exceed the costs, then you regulate. Then you perform the regulation, you engage in the policy, whatever it is that's appropriate. So, for example, in this case, the value of a life, and this is not just a made-up number. This is our federal government's official statistic for the value of a life. The EPA generated this number, but it has since come into widespread usage in lots of different places. The value of a life, according to the EPA, according to our federal government, is $6.2 million. the value of a case of emphysema is about $400,000. That number I made up, and I'll tell you why I made it up later on in the talk. But let's just, for the moment, let's just assume that the case of emphysema is worth $400,000 if we can prevent it. All right, so what are the costs and benefits of this regulation? Well, 5 lives times $6.2 million per life, plus 20 cases of emphysema times $400,000 per case of emphysema, minus 300 million, which is the compliance cost of the regulation, gives you a net benefit of, I believe that should be a $261 million. Net benefit negative $261 million, which implies you shouldn't regulate. Your net benefits are highly negative. Your costs are much, much, much higher than your benefits. So cost-benefit analysis would say this regulation is not worth it. It's not worth spending $300 million to save 5 lives. And you can sort of see that intuitively, because if a life is only worth $6.2 million, $300 million ought to buy us 50 lives or something like that, at least given the government's current numbers. So that's how cost-benefit analysis works. This is the most important decision tool that all of our regulatory agencies and all of our major sort of policymakers in the government have been using for a very, very long time. It has been the most important decision tool for 30 years, ever since President Reagan enshrined it in an executive order back at the beginning of his first term. This is what everyone does. This is what EPA does. This is what the Department of Transportation does. This is what the Occupational Safety and Health Administration does. Every time you see a major regulation that gets announced in the papers, if EPA, for instance, decides to regulate greenhouse gases in the coming administration, that regulation will have been undertaken pursuant to cost-benefit analysis. It's very, very powerful. So Reagan instituted, it has been reaffirmed by every single president since Reagan. A lot of people thought that Presidents Clinton or Obama would reject cost-benefit analysis because it's sometimes unfriendly to regulation, or that's the view at least. But even President Clinton and President Obama have been very strong proponents of cost-benefit analysis. Those of you who attended Cass Sunstein's talks when he was at the law school heard him discuss the work he did on cost-benefit analysis when he was administrator of OIRA. OIRA is the agency within the government that oversees how cost-benefit analysis is done. Sunstein is a dedicated proponent of cost-benefit analysis, and he worked to improve it and to implement it when he was Obama's regulatory czar. Okay. The problem, of course, the reason why cost-benefit analysis has been so powerful is that there's no real alternative. As I said, you can't just sort of say, oh, the life is too valuable, or we can't compare lives and money or something like that. You have to be able to draw a comparison somehow, and there's no alternative to cost-benefit analysis until now. So that's how cost-benefit analysis works, but it's not quite so simple as the previous example would make it seem. There are problems. So to describe the problems, let's talk about how CBA figures out these values. How does cost-benefit analysis decide that a life is worth $6.2 million if we can save it, or that a case of emphysema is worth $400,000 if we can prevent it? There are two main methods that cost-benefit analysis uses. The first is what's called a revealed preference study. I said that you guys are always making sort of life and money trade-offs in your everyday lives. That's what a revealed preference study is. It looks to see what people are actually doing with their own money and their own lives and tries to figure out how they would price their lives. What is the value that you are placing on your own lives? And then the government will just take that value and use it. Or you can use contingent valuation studies, which are sometimes just called stated preference studies. That is a much simpler but also much cruder way of getting at the same questions. We just ask you. We might go to you and say, hey, how much do you think a life ought to be worth? And then you name a number, and we just survey 1,000 people, and we average all those numbers together or something like that, and that's our answer. So cost-benefit analysis tries to use revealed preference studies whenever it can, because economists always like to see what people are actually doing when they've got real money on the table. When we can't, we settle for contingent valuation studies, stated preference studies. Okay. So let's dig into this a little bit. Revealed preference studies. So let's say we've got 2 jobs. Job A and Job B are comparable in essentially every respect we can find, except that Job B involves a 1 in 1,000 risk to life. If you work in Job B, let's say every year, you run a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying. And this is, by the way, this is exactly how revealed preference studies are done. This is how that $6.2 million figure was generated. So let's say that the wage for Job A is $25,000 per year. The wage for Job B is $200 more, $25,200. So the value that the worker places on her own life is that differential, $200, divided by the risk, 1 in 1,000. So that's basically $200,000 per year, or if you imagine the worker is working for 30 years, it's about $6 million over the worker's lifetime. This is how cost-benefit analysis put a number on the value of life. It looked to see what people were actually being paid in order to take on more risky jobs. You can do exactly the same thing for emphysema. You have job A and job B. Only one of them involves a risk of emphysema. And so then you price things out by just trying to figure out what that wage differential is between the job that involves the risk of emphysema and the job that does not. And you multiply that by the available risk. It turns out that, in fact, agencies have not done this for things like emphysema because it's very, very hard to find two similar jobs in which the only salient difference is the risk of emphysema. So in fact, our administrative agencies do not have a value for how much it's worth to avoid a case of emphysema. That's why I had to make that number up. They have a value for life, but lesser diseases, emphysema, bronchitis, you name it. Let's say cases of cancer even that turn out not to be fatal, administrative agencies don't know how to put prices on those things yet. All right. That all sounds pretty good, right? That's sort of nice economist thinking. There's a little bit of a problem. I should say maybe a large bit of a problem. OK, so what are the problems? What if workers have no idea what the actual risk in their job is? In the previous example, I just said it's 1 in 1,000. If you're taking a job, if you're signing up to be a worker of some type, they don't hand you a piece of paper that says, just so you know, the risk to life in this job is 1 in 1,273. So keep that in mind. You have to sort of guess at it or estimate it yourself. Economists have the number because they've been keeping statistics for decades. But workers surely don't know the answer to that question. It's a mystery. So how do you know? Or how do you know what the differences are between jobs? You're looking at two jobs. You're deciding which job to take. It's rarely the case that the two jobs are identical except for the risk to life. No boss comes in and says, well, our job is just the same as the job across the street, except that here, every once in a while, one of your coworkers will bring a gun in and start shooting, so there's a small risk to life. No, I mean, jobs are different on lots of different dimensions. One might be dirtier than the other, or the labor might be a little tougher, we might have to travel a little farther. There are always very different sorts of ways. So in relying on these wage differentials, cost-benefit analysis is assuming a lot of information on the part of the workers. They're assuming that people basically know what the risks are and understand what the differences between these two jobs are. What about the wealth of the workers involved? When cost-benefit analysis does these revealed preference studies, they're doing them with jobs that are dangerous, that have risks to life. Chances are pretty good that you guys are not going to be taking jobs that involve high risks to life unless the legal market, really turns sour and clients start shooting up law offices in the future. These are industrial jobs. And so the amount of money that workers are willing to accept to take one job that's riskier over another is going to be driven by the fact that they're, blue-collar workers who might not be earning a ton of money. If you're only earning $25,000 a year, an extra $200 might mean a lot to you. If you're earning $160,000 a year, that extra $200 might not mean so much after all. So the wealth of the workers, their options in the marketplace, that will drive that wage differential. So when we do revealed preference studies and look at workers in dangerous jobs, what are we learning about? We're learning about how a certain segment of society prices their own lives and what sorts of trade-offs they're willing to make. That segment of society may or may not be representative of the rest of us. And then, most importantly, what happens if workers don't really have a sense of how much their own lives are worth? If I asked you, how much is your life worth in monetary terms, and I made you write down an actual number, what would you say? How would you even go about computing that? You could just try to list the amount of money you think you're going to make throughout your life, but that's not really the answer. That's not how much your life is worth to you and to your family. So you have to have some sense of exactly what it's worth, what you're trading it off against, what you'd really be willing to accept. And that's sort of hard enough at a conceptual level when it comes to your life. It's even harder when it comes to things like emphysema, right? So suppose I said to you, how much would you pay to avoid contracting emphysema? Your first question would probably be, what is it like to have emphysema? And of course, it's very, very hard to know what it's like to have a disease like that, even if you know a lot about the disease, right? Even if you actually were familiar with all the symptoms of emphysema and what it's like to live with it, you might have a tough time gauging what your life would really be like, how happy you'd be if you had emphysema. And if you don't know very much about it, you're going to have an even more difficult time with it. And you might have a tough time estimating how used to having emphysema you're going to be, how readily you're going to adapt to it. And sure enough, so this work is all, to some extent, about this new field called hedonic psychology, which is involved in asking people what their lives are like given their circumstances, the conditions they have, the way they're living their lives, how they spend their time. Some of the major findings of hedonic psychology are that people are really bad at answering questions exactly like this one. We're really bad at what's called effective forecasting, figuring out how we're going to feel in the future if we have some condition or something happens to us. We're very bad at guessing how we're going to feel if we win the lottery and make a lot of money. We're very bad at guessing how we're going to feel if we go bankrupt. We're very bad at guessing how we'll feel if we'll go get divorced, or if we will lose the use of one of our limbs or contract a disease or any number of other things. We're bad at making predictions about our own states of being in the future. And we're also bad at anticipating, kind of how easily we'll adapt to new conditions. And if we're bad at guessing what we're going to feel like in the future, we're definitely going to be bad at estimating how much it would be worth to us to avoid feeling that way or to get to feel that way. Okay, so these are real problems. How are people supposed to estimate about hypothetical questions like that? Now, if you don't like revealed preference studies, or you can't do them, you can turn to contingent valuation studies. So there are some goods that aren't traded in the marketplace. People's lives are at some level traded in the marketplace because people decide to take dangerous jobs or not take dangerous jobs. But there are some sorts of goods that are not traded, like clean air. There isn't a market for clean air. We aren't really making daily decisions about how much to buy or sell clean air for. So let's say we have a regulation mandating scrubbers on smokestacks, which will generate clean air. How do we estimate the benefits of being able to walk outside and see the sun as opposed to seeing only smog? So CBA uses contingent valuation studies, which, as I said, are just a fancy word for surveys. You ask people, how much would you pay for cleaner air? And then, say the average person says $1,000, and there are 1,000 people who would be affected by the regulation. You say, well, each of those 1,000 people would be willing to pay $1,000. Therefore, this regulation is worth $1 million. Great, right? Terrific. Bigger problems with contingent valuation surveys. So they have all the same problems with revealed preference studies in that we're asking people to remember a lot, to know a lot of information about what it's going to be like to have clean skies and to estimate how they're going to feel living in a world with cleaner skies as opposed to a world with less clean skies. But they're also entirely hypothetical. We're just sort of asking people to name numbers out of thin air. And economists like it when there's actual money on the table. They don't like it when we're asking people to name numbers. And the numbers they name are going to be affected by how much money they have, right? If you ask a millionaire how much they'd be willing to pay to be able to see the sun every day, you're going to get a different number than if you ask someone making $25,000 a year. That should just seem intuitively obvious. So the population you survey is going to matter a lot. And there's no budget, They ask me, how much would you be willing to pay for clean skies? I'm going to say, $1 trillion, because it's not my money, right? So nobody's being held to a budget. If we don't limit people to a budget, how are we going to trust the numbers we get? So sometimes they try to limit people to budgets. They say, all right, you are president of the country. You've got $1 million to spend. What percentage of it would you spend on clean air or something like that? But maybe I actually would spend $1 trillion. How do they know that I don't prize being able to see the sun above everything else? It's very, very hard, even if you want to limit people to a budget, to pick a budget limit that's just not arbitrary. Maybe the most important thing to me is clean skies, or to name some other things that people use contingent valuation surveys for. Maybe the most important thing to me is, saving an endangered species or something like that. What are you going to do? Okay, so not surprisingly, economists think that contingent valuation surveys are highly unreliable. So our alternative is what we call well-being analysis. And the idea is, instead of monetizing costs and benefits, instead of trying to use these techniques to convert them into dollars and cents, we're going to hedonize them. We're going to ask the same sorts of questions about how people feel, whether these sorts of regulations or whether these goods make people feel better in their lives or make people feel worse. So we're going to try to determine the effect that a given cost or benefit has on someone in well-being terms. How well is your life going for you? How happy are you given all the things that are going on in your life? And then we're going to add these costs and benefits up in hedonic terms. So instead of adding them up in terms of money, we're going to create hedonic units on which we can measure these things, and we'll add them up that way. The hedonic values, we think, are going to be at least as good of proxies for welfare. Human welfare is the thing we care about at bottom, right? Money is not valuable as an end in itself. It's an instrumental good. It buys us welfare. It buys things that lead to good lives. Well, what's a better proxy for whether you're leading a good life? The money involved, or whether you actually say you're leading a good life? So we think these things are going to be pretty good proxies. And so let me give you an example about how this would work. So let's go back to our chromium regulation. So we know the costs in dollars. We know what the compliance costs for our chromium manufacturers will be. So we're going to take data from wealthy people and less wealthy people, and we're going to determine the impact of money on well-being. If it's going to cost our society $300 million to implement the chromium regulation, let's see how much welfare loss that $300 million is really going to create. How many fewer flat screen TVs will everyone get to buy? How many fewer miles will they be able to drive on their cars, et cetera? And how much will their actual well-being go down? So we can figure by checking the well-being of people of different income levels, we can figure out the impact of money on your well-being. For the lives that will be saved, we're just going to determine the average well-being of someone's life. We're going to ask a lot of people, how much well-being do you have? How well is your life going? And then we can just multiply that by the number of people affected and by the number of years of life that they're going to lose, if they die early because of a workplace chemical. And we just multiply those things together. And then for cases of emphysema, we can look at people who have emphysema and who don't have emphysema. We can ask the people who have emphysema, how well is your life going? We can ask the people who don't have emphysema, how well is your life going? And that differential, well, that's the well-being cost of contracting a case of emphysema. And so basically, we can determine the values of all these same costs and benefits in well-being terms. How much better is someone's life, or how much worse is someone's life as a result of this consequence, rather than in monetary terms. OK, why is this any better? It's better for a couple of really important reasons. So first of all all we're asking people is basic demographic information. Who are you? What is your income level? What are you doing right now? How many kids? What's your marital status, et cetera? Things that are easy to answer. And the question, how well is your life going right now? How well is it going for you right now at this very instant? Now, that may seem sort of an abstract question, but think about what that question does not require you to know. It doesn't require you to know anything about the risks posed by your job, information you may not have. It doesn't matter how wealthy you are in some sense. We know how wealthy you are. We can factor that into the equation. That's easy to do. So we just want you to tell us how well your life is going. And more importantly, you don't have to guess at or hypothesize about any kind of future state of being. If we asked you, how much would you be willing to pay for clean skies, you have to think to yourself, how much am I really going to value clean skies if I got them? If we asked you how much are you willing to pay to avoid a case of emphysema, you have to think to yourself, what would it be like to have emphysema? How much am I going to care about that? What's the trade-off that would really be worth it to me? Here, you don't have to ask yourself any of those questions. You don't have to guess. You don't have to hypothesize. We're taking those difficult pieces out of the equation, and those are the places precisely where people are highly error-prone. We're asking a question that's a little sort of conceptually weird, how well is your life going? But we're only asking you to report on how your life is going right now, this instant. And the fact that we're limiting it to right now, this instant, that's what makes this an easier and much more reliable question. And sure, maybe some of you are very happy people, and so life is always going really well, and that's fine. And some of you are very unhappy people, and life is always going really badly, and that's a bummer, but I get it. But that's OK, because we can survey the same people over and over and over again as time goes on. And so we can figure out how changes make your levels of well-being change. So that happy person, maybe you're a super happy person, even after you contract emphysema, but we still know, because we've surveyed you before and after you got it, we know how much happier you were before you had emphysema, so we can watch to see how it drops. And ditto for the unhappy person. Even if they started out very unhappy, we can see how much their happiness changes after they get a disease, or conversely, get married, or have a park built nearby, or move to an area with cleaner skies, or any number of other things, right? All we have to do is look at the differential. So even though it's kind of conceptually weird, and who knows what you're going to say, as long as we're looking at the same people over time, we'll get answers that will make sense to us, because we can see how people's levels of well-being change as their life circumstances change. OK, I've talked about all that. The difference between well-being analysis and cost-benefit analysis is not just the unit used, dollars versus, we're going to call them WBUs, well-being units, but it doesn't really matter. It's the difference in the type of question being asked. Well-being analysis only requires you ask someone, how are things going right now? Cost-benefit analysis requires asking all sorts of questions involving guesses and predictions about the future, the sorts of things people are very bad at. And that's really the crucial difference. OK. So I'm going to show how this works in real, honest-to-goodness life, and then I'll be done. So in 1998, the EPA passed a regulation governing pulp and paper production, which at that time used a very dangerous chlorine chemical. And that chlorine chemical would be expelled by these pulp and paper mills and sent into the waterways, and it would get into fish, and then people who fished and ate the fish would get this chlorine chemical into their bodies and die from it. So they banned these hazardous chlorine chemicals. They considered 3 options: option A, option B, and option TCF. TCF just stands for total chlorine free. So it's basically in degrees of stringency. A is the least stringent, B is second most stringent, TCF is the most stringent, the most complete banning of all these chemicals. What are the costs of this regulation? Well, they're basically compliance costs, because now all these pulp and paper manufacturers have to switch to some more expensive sort of chemical and not use these cheaper chlorine compounds that they want to use. There's also possibly unemployment. If you make these firms pay all this money, you create unemployment. EPA did not actually estimate the cost of unemployment. Agencies don't currently estimate the cost of unemployment when they do cost-benefit analysis. I've done separate work with Professor Posner in which we say that agencies need to estimate the cost of unemployment because unemployment is important in these cases. And so for our purposes, for our example, I actually figured out all the unemployment numbers and plugged them into the analysis just to make it more complete. So the CBA I'm going to show you is in some sense more complete than the CBA that the EPA did at the time. What are the benefits? Well, there's cheaper sludge disposal. It's easier to get rid of the sludge that the paper mill generates if it doesn't have chlorine compounds in it. That's basically just a monetary benefit. There are fewer fishing advisories. Apparently, when the pulp and paper mills dump a lot of chlorine into the water, the local fish and wildlife organizations had to issue advisories and say nobody gets to fish right now, and that was very costly because all the fishermen don't get to fish and they're angry about that. And then most importantly, fewer cancer deaths. That's the whole shooting match. We don't want people to get these chlorine compounds in them and have it cause cancer. Okay, so those are the costs and benefits. Here is EPA's cost-benefit analysis. All these numbers are in millions of dollars as of 1995. So you can see here, I mean, where are the big numbers on this table? The big numbers in this table are at the top. The compliance costs are very large. And how does EPA price the benefits of the lives saved? Pretty low, right? Even under the total chlorine-free option, the value of the lives saved are somewhere between $2 and $25 million. The uncertainty is just because they don't know exactly how many lives they're going to save. So what are the net results? Well, the net benefits of even option A are negative $228.3 million, and the net benefits of the other options are even worse. So based on this information, if you were just doing a cost-benefit analysis, you would say, don't regulate. Big mistake to regulate here. How would well-being analysis do the same thing? OK, so we're going to translate everything into well-being units on a scale of 0 to 10. And that corresponds to the question we'd ask people. How well is your life going right now for you? Scale of 0 to 10, tell us the answer. Compliance costs and monetary benefits. We've done, not us, but psychologists have done research determining the effect of money on well-being. And it turns out that money has a small but steady effect on well-being. So you can forget about the math details. It's not very important. But basically, as your income increases quite a lot, you get small gains of well-being, small amounts of well-being units. One of the major findings of this line of hedonic research is that large gains in wealth don't have that large an effect on people's well-being once you're sort of past, well outside of the poverty range. Once you get past about $40,000 of income a year. And that makes a certain amount of sense because, look, I mean, the 54-inch television is better than the 30-inch television, but it's not that much better. You're still going to sort of enjoy watching both of them. And, driving a Mercedes is, I guess, better than, driving a Honda. But, frankly, if you have a car, it's not so bad either. So basically, the finding is there's a pretty rapidly diminishing marginal utility to money, which is something that shouldn't come as a huge surprise. So that's how we're going to deal with compliance costs. And the monetary benefits are just the cheaper sludge disposal and the fewer fishing advisories. Then there are the cancer deaths avoided. So the average person says on a scale of 0 to 10, my well-being is a 7.4. But on the other hand, if a person is sick with cancer, they lose 0.238 units of well-being during the time that they're sick. So we can just sort of say, here's how many lives we're going to save. Here's how much those lives are worth per year. Here's how many years of life will be saved, and multiply it all together, subtracting from that the value, and also, by the way, I should say, sorry, adding to that the value of avoiding having people get cancer and then be less happy while they have cancer. And then for unemployment, so there's a big decline in well-being while you're unemployed. That should make some sense, right? It's bad to be unemployed. That makes nobody happy. And there's a decline in well-being even after reemployment. It turns out, and this is sort of an interesting finding, if you become unemployed, and you're unemployed for a significant amount of time, and then you find another job afterwards, there's still some sort of lingering unhappiness that remains. And that makes a certain amount of sense, because being unemployed is very, it's kind of psychologically difficult for a lot of people. And so, even after you've found a new job, sometimes people will still have doubts. They'll feel insecure, is I think the best way to explain it. They're always worried, I remember what it was like to be unemployed back then. I hope doesn't happen to me again. I'm a little worried that it might happen to me at a future time. So those are the harms from unemployment. Again, this is all stuff that was not in the original cost-benefit analysis. Now we're going to add it in. So here is a well-being analysis, the same thing. So we have monetary costs and then the welfare effect of the monetary costs. The cancer case is avoided, and then the welfare effect of the cancer case is avoided. The jobs lost, the welfare effect of the jobs lost, and then our total welfare effect. And the answer is that this all of a sudden looks good. It looks positive. We're saving 67 units of welfare by promulgating this regulation. 67 units of welfare, well, I said the average person registers themselves as 7.4. So 67 units of welfare is like 9.5 years of life, basically. It's like we're saving 9.5 years of somebody's life, even after we've subtracted out all the costs of the regulation. And you can see here, what's changed is, in the previous cost-benefit analysis, the money loomed really, really large because people didn't seem to price their lives all that highly. When we translate this into well-being terms, and we ask them, instead of, how much would you pay for things, how is your life actually going, and we look at determine what impact these various factors actually have on a person's life, we learn, well, the money isn't really all that big of a deal if you imagine that the $300 million is being spread out among a lot of different people. What's a couple extra dollars here or there for someone to pay? But boy, avoiding having people die early because of cancer, that's a really big deal. And actually, avoiding unemployment is a pretty big deal as well. So the real trade-off in this regulation, we think, is between lives that are being saved and cases of unemployment that are being caused. And in this case, we think, at least for option A, that trade-off counsels in favor of regulating. Option B still looks pretty bad, and option TCF, we can't figure out all the answers. But at least here, option A looks like the right way to go. So we think that well-being analysis is going to provide much more accurate answers in the long run about what the real welfare effects of these regulations will be. And because welfare is what we care about, because in the end what we're trying to do is improve human lives, we ought to be picking the thing that gives us more information, more valuable information about how a regulation will really impact people's lives, not just how much money it will save or lose, when those monetary values are filtered through all of the trouble that people have making guesses about what's going to go on. OK, so I'm done, and I'm now excited to take your questions and comments. Yeah, OK, so those are all great questions. OK, I'm going to take them slightly out of order. So first question, these are by and large longitudinal data, not cross-sectional data, meaning we're looking at the same people over time. These are based on large-scale surveys that were done with the General Social Survey. It's a survey that's given out to 50,000 Americans every year. It's 1 million pages long. It asks you questions about everything. And so every single year, the same 50,000 people are reporting kind of everything that's happened to them in that year and how it made them feel, how it affected their well-being. There's a similar one being done in Britain, the British Household Panel Survey, also given to 50,000 Britons. So we have big, robust sets of longitudinal data where we're looking at the same people over time, and we can really see, OK, this person started out really happy, but then look, they got cancer and they were a lot less happy, or whatever else. Let's see, second question, effects on other people. So the way that we do this well-being analysis doesn't talk about any of the effects that any of these things will have on other people outside of the particular individuals. But then the thing is that neither does cost-benefit analysis. So that's one area in which both of those methodologies could definitely be improved. They can be improved to take into account the fact that if somebody dies, that has ripple effects, not just on themselves, but of course on their family and friends and everyone else. So here we're just sort of trying to do a back-of-the-envelope calculation to show that it's possible. Ideally, we would do a well-being analysis that included everyone who came in contact with an affected person. In that respect, at least, we're not doing any worse than cost-benefit analysis. And then the last question, so I think I want to sort of, I think your last question is really important. I kind of want to reframe it in a broader sense, which is, I think what you're saying is maybe there's a way in which people talk about what's going on in their lives, in which they sort of say, well, maybe they're having a terrible, terrible, miserable time. But let's say, for instance, you've got someone who's the CEO of a company, and that CEO makes $10 million a year, and they're super successful, and they're cover of Forbes magazine. And they just feel like, I'm the CEO of this major company. I should be happy. I should be successful. Everyone will expect me to be happy. And so even though they're deeply unhappy because they don't get to spend any time with their children and their family, and they're just working all the time, and it's grueling, maybe they would say, oh yeah, my life is going really well. I'm actually really happy. And so maybe there would be differential effects of that. Maybe it's more pronounced for people in jobs versus certain types of diseases or whatever else. So that's kind of your point about cancer and unemployment sort of broadened. So that's a real issue whenever we ask people how they're doing. I mean, I think even sort of in those terms, the way you've described them, it's less of an issue than asking people to guess about how they're going to feel about something in the future, which is what cost-benefit analysis requires. But it's a real issue. And we think that the best way to get at that issue is by changing the way in which we decide what sorts of questions to ask people. So the way that these large surveys that I was describing do it is that they just ask you at the end of the year, all things considered, how was that year for you? How happy were you during that whole year? And I think that that sort of a question really invites kind of judgment rather than explanation, right? So it's going to invite people to sort of say, well, actually, I was pretty miserable all year, but I'm the CEO, so I guess I have to say that I'm happy. I'm going to give myself an 8 out of 10 or whatever. The better way of doing it, I think, is just to ask people in an instant, buzz a person and say, how are you doing right now, this very instant? So that CEO, even if that CEO thinks that sort of writ large they ought to be saying that their job is great and they love everything and their lives are going really well, if you happen to beep them while they're in the middle of a brutal meeting or while it's 9 p.m. and they're missing bedtime with their kids or something like that, they're much more likely to just sort of report honestly, oh yeah, right now things are going badly, but the rest of my life is great. So if you just got a sort of instantaneous piece of data like that, and then you did that for lots and lots of people and you added it up over and over and over again, now you get the same picture. You understand how people's lives are going the same way, but you're doing it by asking a question that is much more reliable. There's a graduate student, by the way, a postdoc actually at Harvard University, working in a lab doing this sort of thing. He built an iPhone app, which I encourage you all to check out. It's called, I think his website is trackyourhappiness.com. And basically you download this app on your iPhone and you input a bunch of demographic information, who you are and what you're doing. And then every once in a while, the iPhone app will sort of beep at you and say, hey, tell me what you're doing right now and how happy you are. And so lots and lots of people have volunteered to do this, and he's collected millions upon millions of points of data spelling out exactly how people's lives are going and what's making them happy and what's not making them happy. And I think that that's the much better way of collecting that data. By the way, the side benefit of that app is that at the end of it, as a sort of favor to you for participating in the study, they'll print out a little sort of, spreadsheet diagram type thing, basically telling you all the things in your life that make you the happiest and the things that make you the least happy, so you can kind of figure out what you want to do in your life going forward. You learn like, wait a minute, spending time with my dog is great and spending time in class is a little lousy, so I have to, cut class and hang out with my dog. So I did this, and it turned out the thing that makes me happiest is giving lunch talks, so that's what I'm here. Yes?
I have a question about this instantaneous happiness marker. I'm wondering what sort of things you're using when you're tracking instantaneous happiness as opposed to when you're tracking meaning. I guess that was one of my main things that it seems like really interesting and great, but then a lot of the things that you do in your life are really kind of suck when you're doing them, but you gain a lot of great meaning out of them. Raising children would be maybe something. And then also maybe when you look back on your life, you gain a lot of happiness from things that instantaneously while you're doing them, they're sort of awful, like maybe going to class.
Okay, I think it's a great point. But I think the answer is you're losing nothing. And I'll tell you why you're losing nothing. Because all the things that you're talking about that are terrible in the moment, if going to class were terrible in the moment, which we all know it's not, that would be a good example. But let's talk about running a marathon. Right? I know some people like running marathons. I think those are crazy people. Let's just sort of stipulate that running a marathon is really kind of lousy while it's going on, but it's great afterwards. And it might even be great long afterwards because you have this sense of satisfaction and achievement. I ran this marathon. And you also are in great shape now, and that has terrific health benefits down the road. You feel better about yourself, and so on and so forth. If you were only ever pinged while you were running the marathon, let's put aside for a second the question of how you would answer your iPhone while you're running a marathon. If you're only ever pinged during the marathon, then yeah, we're going to lose a ton of information because all of the sort of ongoing benefits of having decided to run the marathon will be completely ignored. But the whole point is that we're asking the same people over and over and over again throughout their lives. And so, well, if we ask you during the marathon, you'd be saying, yeah, this kind of stinks. If we ask you after the marathon, you're going to say, oh, I feel great. I have this huge rush of achievement and success. If we ask you 2 weeks later, maybe you're not even thinking of the marathon at that point, but you're in really good health because you trained for it so hard. And you might say, oh, yeah, I feel great because I haven't been sick lately, and I'm just, I I feel really vibrant and so forth. We ask you 2 years later, maybe you're sort of thinking back, I remember when I ran that marathon and that was really terrific and I feel really good about it and have this sense of pride in my own achievements. Plus, I'm really healthy now and my my joints are in great shape or whatever else. All those sorts of benefits that you think are going to cash out from that activity. And going to class, same way, right? Maybe while it's going on, not so great, but 5 years later when you're in some job you really like, you're going to be saying, this is terrific, I have this really fulfilling occupation, et cetera. All that stuff will be cashed out later on, and we're going to pick all of that up. That's exactly the point. So yeah, it's not going to work very well if you're only asking people in the moment of that activity, but later on, even if they don't know it, even if they're not thinking about it, we'll still be able to say, hey, look, this person's a lot healthier than they were before they trained for that marathon. So their well-being numbers are a lot higher now than before they ran it, and that counts. That still matters, and we're going to measure all of that. Yeah, Remy.
It's kind of a related question, but one of the nice things about CBA is that it allows you to discount future costs and wealth. So I guess, should we be discounting future happiness, and if so, how would we do that?
Okay, so another great question. These are great questions. I would say the fact that we can discount future wealth is one of the big problems with cost-benefit analysis, not one of the benefits of it. Because how do we figure out what that discount rate should be? So I'll flip back to this other slide. So it says here millions of $1995 at the top. It's because if you want to measure things, you have to measure them in constant dollars, because $1 in 1995 is unfortunately not worth the same amount as $1 in 1975 or $1 in 2012. So as Remy suggests, we have to discount. We have to make conversions between dollars in 2012 and dollars in 1995 or whatever else. How do we make those conversions? There is enormous, enormous, enormous debate on exactly what our conversion factors should be, what the discount factors between these various years should be, and there is no common agreement. So EPA, the same agency which is perfectly happy to announce that a human life is worth $6.2 million, has not been able to settle on a discount rate because it is too controversial. So they report two discount rates, 3% and 5%. All these numbers are for 3%. I could have given you the same table with, 3% and 7%. I could have given you the same table with a 7% discount rate. They cannot figure out what the right discount rate is. No one can figure out what the right discount rate is, and it makes an enormous difference. So I'll do climate change as an example. If you think that the appropriate discount rate is 1%, which means 1% discount rate basically just means $1 in 2013 is worth 99% of what $1 in 2012 is worth, and $1 in 2014 is worth 99% of what $1 in 2013 is worth. If you think that 1% is the appropriate discount rate, we ought to be regulating carbon dioxide production like crazy right now. We basically ought to ban the automobile. If you think that the discount rate is 10%, if you think that $1 in 2014 is only worth 90% of what $1 in 2013 is worth, we basically ought to go and light all of our coal reserves on fire instantaneously and produce as much carbon dioxide. I mean, I'm sort of only slightly exaggerating, but the choice between a 1% discount rate and a 10% discount rate, or even a 3% and a 7% discount rate, is a mammoth and enormous choice, because a lot of the costs and benefits of regulation will occur 30 or 50 years in the future. And if you're discounting 7% for 50 years, that's a really big change compared with discounting 3% for 50 years. So I think the discount rate is a big negative for cost-benefit analysis. One of the advantages, I think, of well-being analysis is that we don't really have to discount in quite the same way. 1 unit of well-being for your life next year is probably worth the same to you. I mean, maybe there's a moral argument that it's worth a different amount to you next year than it would be this year, but I don't really think so. I think it's probably worth about the same amount. So as long as we have the same sorts of people involved, we don't have to worry about discounting nearly so much with well-being analysis as we would with cost-benefit analysis. It doesn't remove all the problems. There are some technical reasons why not every single problem goes away, but a lot of the big problems go away because it's not money. Money is worth less in the future for obvious reasons. Inflation, the value of investing, et cetera. Well-being, it's not the same story. Other questions? Yes, Steve.
How does this differ, or how is this revolutionary from the gross national happiness movements that were in vogue in the 1970s when Bhutan measured their GNP rather by GNH, and a lot of economists started studying this? I mean, I know that you're applying this to cost-benefit or to analysis in government programs, but I think they did that too, and sort of where's the break? I
mean, it's based on a similar sort of idea, which is instead of asking how much money we have, let's ask how happy everybody is. And all those sorts of things, gross national happiness, those are becoming a very big deal now, and it's not just Bhutan. So The former president of France thinks that France ought to be measuring its total happiness that way. The current prime minister of Britain, David Cameron, wants to measure Britain's gross national happiness. Other important jurisdictions like Somerville, Massachusetts have decided they ought to be measuring gross national happiness. It's the same principle. It's the same principle of trying to add up people's sort of welfare states. They're doing it in the crudest way possible, basically. They're just sort of taking a national, let's survey 10 people and pick the average number. They'll give some answer, pick the average number, and then let's multiply that by our entire population. But just because you've got a number for your gross national happiness, that doesn't tell you what to do about anything or how to make policy or how to regulate or anything like that. What we're trying to do is try to figure out how to use these same data to actually make real sort of fine-grained policy decisions as a substitute, not just sort of as a measure for how everything's going, we're hunky-dory or we're not so hunky-dory, but actually as a way of determining whether a policy should be implemented or not, what will be the effects of some sort of a policy. And that's where sort of what we're doing goes multiple steps beyond just sort of gross national happiness that these other countries were kind of playing around with years ago and are now starting to latch onto a little bit more. Other questions? Yeah.
So I'm clearly not like an expert in hedonic psychology, but my understanding is that there's at least some data to suggest that we're very resilient in terms of like when we have these disruptions in our life.
Yes. Maybe
like a year later, or well, there'll at least be like a period where we adjust our well-being and we see our life as being a lower quality.
Yeah.
But eventually it kind of adjusts and we're at the same point almost before. I know that's true. In particular, I think the data was on like if you lose a spouse or things like that. Am I completely wrong about that, or is this something that needs to be taken into account in this? Or
You're exactly right about that. That's one of the most important findings of the hedonic psychology. I sort of refer to that as adaptation. We adapt to new circumstances very, very well. Spouse is one where we don't necessarily adapt all that well. There's a nice, I always sound like a sort of crazy person when I say these sorts of things. There's a paper, somebody wrote a paper in which they looked at the welfare losses over time from the loss of various family members. And so, you suffer a huge welfare loss if you lose a child, a very big welfare loss if you lose a spouse. I mean, this makes perfect sense, right? A somewhat smaller welfare loss if you lose a parent or a sibling, and a welfare gain if you lose an in-law. So that's very true. So let me just say, so it's very true and extremely important. And not only should it be factored into everything, but it is. All these numbers are based on this sort of adaptation point. These are all numbers gleaned, given that we know that people are going to adapt. The key thing, though, is that there are some things that people are really good at adapting to, and other things that people are really bad at adapting to. So unemployment actually is one of them. People do not adapt well to unemployment. If you've been unemployed for a long time, it gets worse for you, not better, which maybe makes a certain amount of sense. Certain types of injuries are adaptable. If you lose the use of a limb, say one of you lose an arm, let's say, in a workplace accident, in the short term, that's really, really terrible for you in terms of your well-being, but you adapt reasonably quickly. I think people sort of forget that they've lost the limb and they learn to do everything that they were ever able to do just using the one arm beforehand. But something like chronic pain is very different. If you're suffering from chronic pain, you do not adapt to it, probably because you can't put it in the back of your mind. You can't forget about it. It's omnipresent. It's always sort of foregrounded for you. And so people with chronic pain or chronic headaches or ringing in the ears, they have a tremendously tough time adapting, which I think makes a lot of sense because you can't kind of get on with the normal process of life if you're constantly being reminded about this thing that's afflicting you. And so one of the important things about doing it this way, as opposed to doing it with cost-benefit analysis, is we actually find out what are the things that really affect people a lot and which are the things that we kind of get used to over time that affect people somewhat less. Whereas cost-benefit analysis never gets to that question because it's only asking how much do you think something is going to affect you. So if you gave people the choice between losing an arm and suffering from chronic pain for the rest of their lives, probably a lot of people are going to pick the chronic pain. But if you actually ask people suffering from those two things, boy, the people who've lost an arm seem to be doing much, much, much better. And if we're making policy, if we're deciding sort of what types of workplace injuries we want to protect against and spend the most money avoiding, we want to know that information. We don't want people just guessing. Any questions? Yeah.
So I have a lot of questions about how you're calculating that, but on the viewpoint, there are certain life events that change you in ways that don't affect your happiness. So if you lost half your IQ points, you might be as happy as you were before, but you certainly experienced a substantial loss.
Yeah.
How do you take that into account?
Yeah, that's a really sort of deep, important philosophical question that I don't have a particularly good answer to. I don't really know what it means. So there are a couple things you could say, right? So I'll lay a couple of options on the table, and then I'm going to punt and tell you I don't know which one it is. So one option you can say is, that's just like two different people. Like one person ceased to be and a new person came into being. And now I don't know how to measure that thing. You could say, well, person one died and person two was born, and you could try to measure those two people. I don't really know if that's the right approach. Another thing you could say is, like, look, I don't care about the loss of IQ points. That doesn't make you a different person any more than going to law school makes you a different person, or learning to drive makes you a different person. We're just going to measure your happiness according to you the whole way. And so if you said that you were a 7 back before you lost IQ, and then you became a 7.5 after you lost IQ, that's the answer. That's who you are. And we're going to credit that accordingly and measure it that way. I don't really know what the answer to that is either exactly. So I think this is kind of a deep, intractable problem that I'm not sure how to solve. But here's the thing. Cost-benefit analysis certainly doesn't know how to solve it either. There's no way that cost-benefit analysis is getting at those sorts of questions either. You might say, well, the person was willing to pay X for this benefit beforehand, and why now? What do we do with those numbers? Cost-benefit analysis shrugs its shoulders and adds them up. And so we can do the same thing, or we can try to figure out as a matter of philosophy which of these approaches we think is best and kind of adapt ourselves that way. But either way, we're not doing any worse than the status quo, I think, is the way we feel about it. Yeah, Ryan.
So I'm curious about how to control the manipulability of the output of both both functions. I mean, in the EPA example, the benefit.
Well, I hope we don't need the slides any longer.
In the EPA example, the benefits are largely hypothetical because the harms that they're going after don't necessarily have a single source to them, and costs that were not listed on there are like administrative costs, enforcement costs, reduced competition because of new barriers to entry, and things like that.
So sorry, I missed a little bit of your question when I was fiddling with the light. So you're saying that there are a number of costs that are not included in cost-benefit analysis, and
the benefits side is arguably malleable insofar as things don't have one cause like cancer. Those might have many causes that the regulation doesn't.
Yeah, I agree with you. Those are real problems. So I already said, cost-benefit analysis didn't include unemployment costs. Still doesn't include unemployment costs. I'm including them in these examples through, because I believe that they should be included, and we're just trying to, I'm trying to give cost-benefit analysis the benefit of the doubt and do it as well as it can be done. So what we're talking about are the inputs to these two types of analytical methods, right? So the inputs to cost-benefit analysis, how many lives will be saved, what will the compliance cost be, et cetera, and the inputs to well-being analysis. Those inputs are the same. The first step of any type of regulatory decision is always going to be, how many lives will this regulation actually save? Or how many cases of emphysema will it actually avoid? And that will be, what to include and whether to include it and what those numbers are, that will be manipulable irrespective of whether we're doing cost-benefit analysis or whether we're doing well-being analysis. So I think that separately, abstracted away from which of these two decision procedures you like more, agencies ought to do a much better job of trying to justify their claims about what the benefits and costs will be, and also justify their selection of which benefits and costs to include in a regulation. I think it's a little crazy that these agencies have just said, we don't have data on emphysema and bronchitis and things like that, so we're just not going to include them, period. They need to include them or figure out a really principled reason not to include them. But those problems will exist no matter what type of decision procedure you want to use, whether it's CBA or WBA. Other questions? Yeah?
So those numbers on the final slide made it seem to me like the monetary cost to a regulation will really never matter because those numbers were so small. I'm wondering if that's right, and if it is, then it seems like we could change that regulation to add $500 million more in spending. That'll save a couple jobs or something, and the total benefit will go up.
Yeah, this is a really important point also. So you're absolutely right that the monetary contribution is very, very small in our, when we actually redo this as a well-being analysis. But the thing that we're upfront about when I in the paper that we wrote, and I sort of glossed over a little bit here, is it depends on your assumptions about where those monetary costs are going to fall. So we basically assumed that kind of every middle income American is going to have to pay a couple dollars extra to get paper from now on. But actually, if those paper costs are falling on people who aren't making very much money, the person who makes $20,000 that has to send their kid to school or something like that, well, then the monetary impact of those costs will be higher. It depends a lot on whether we're just sort of taking a dollar from someone making $70,000 a year, or whether we're taking $100 away from somebody making $25,000 a year. And that should make sense to you guys. Those will be very, very different types of impacts because that money is just worth so much more to people when they're making less of it. So that's one point, is you have to try to figure out where the costs are actually going to fall on people, and if they're actually falling to some degree on people who don't have a lot of money, then those costs are going to be very important. If they're only falling on people who have quite a lot of money and it's only a few dollars here and there, they're not going to be that important. The second thing, of course, is that if what we're doing is spending a lot of money and destroying a lot of wealth, we're losing opportunities to spend that money elsewhere. So it's not quite the case that we'd be willing to spend another $500 million just to save one more life, as you suggested, because maybe that $500 million can be better spent somewhere else. We're destroying wealth even as we're maybe improving, even if we're improving welfare, I should say. And at a certain point, if we spend so much money, if we went to the option TCF, total chlorine free, just to save an extra half of a person per year or something like that, and spent tons more money and laid off lots and lots more people and so forth and so on, eventually the next regulation that comes along, well, maybe everyone's a little bit poorer, and now the money we want to spend on our next regulation is going to hurt us all a little bit more. So I think that's a good reason not to throw out cost-benefit analysis, but to use it alongside well-being analysis. Well-being analysis will give you a picture of the welfare effects of your particular proposal. Cost-benefit analysis will tell you whether you're creating a lot of wealth or destroying a lot of wealth. And if you have something that has beneficial well-being effects but involves destroying a lot of wealth, well, it's probably a bad idea to promulgate that regulation. Even if it's good in the short term, it's going to hurt you in the longer term if now you don't have money left around for doing other good things, or if people are really much closer to the sort of level of being able to scrape by. So, yeah, I mean, in the near term, I think that sort of the bottom line is that as long as we're distributing the cost of these things widely, we're a pretty wealthy society. We're able to bear some real costs if it means being able to save lives. But if we start squandering a lot of that wealth, or if we make the poorest people the ones who must bear those sorts of costs, then we're going to run into a lot of trouble. Other questions? Yes, please.
When you are talking about doing the well-being analysis, do you see any problem or risk pertaining to your survey? Because I know in
Pertaining to what?
To the survey.
Yeah.
Because I know there is some task that even you are asking, well, in case the survey is made in a questionnaire, for example, it contains multiple choice. If they are essentially the same questions, or the choices, the sequence of the choices changed, for instance, or if the questions is asked in a different way, either positive or negative count, so the result of the survey could be different.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great point. So the point, the point was that the way that surveys are structured, the order of questions asked can have a big impact on the outcome of the surveys. And so this has been demonstrated in well-being surveys over and over and over again. So some versions of these well-being surveys at the beginning, they would first ask people about all the things that had happened during the year, and then they would ask about the sort of person's well-being. And basically it skewed people to extremes. People who had had kind of bad years, if they'd gotten divorced or if they'd been sick or something like that, they would answer at the end, oh yeah, I had a terrible year, this was miserable, and they'd give you some very, very low well-being number. People who had a great year, having been reminded what a great year they had, they'd give you some very high number. On the other hand, if you asked the how is your life going question first, and then only asked the well-being, and then only asked the sort of what happened to you in the last year question second, you got a very different sort of set of circumstances. They didn't skew things nearly as far. So part of it is just developing better survey methodology. We want to ask people how they're doing and how their lives are going before we start reminding them of all the things going on in their lives so that we don't sort of skew the information. Part of it is what I described earlier, which is let's try to get more granular data and ask people just how are things going for you right now in this particular moment so we don't sort of run those same types of risks. And part of it is just if we think that there are different ways of conducting a survey, maybe just varying those options and trying it out different ways to see what's working better, what's working worse, or to try to get some sort of a moving average of it. So yeah, I mean, anytime you're asking surveys of people, you always have to be a little bit worried about the data you're going to get from those surveys. I guess one thing that I think is valuable about this approach to research is that the survey is really only asking like the easiest possible question for someone to answer. You know, not how much would you pay for something, not how much do you value it, but just purely how are you doing right now, sort of period, full stop. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has a question. Yes?
So part of the logic of what you're saying would seem to suggest to me that if we had someone who had $5 million and there was a regulation that took $4 million away from that person, hedonic psychology would suggest that that person wouldn't be less well off whatsoever, and that they're not true?
No, they'd be somewhat less well off. I mean, it wouldn't be losing, if you have $5 million and you lose $4 million of it, it wouldn't be as devastating as you might imagine. I mean, you still have $1 million and you're doing pretty well, but you know, it would still hurt the person. And also, you know, when you say take from, like if we had someone walk into their house and rob them, that would be pretty bad also. So, you know, the method of taking will matter as well. But anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but go on.
So the reason I say that is because my understanding of the research says that any dollar after about $80,000, the marginal value of that dollar up to infinity is basically close to zero. So the logic would suggest that taking a large sum of money from wealthy people has none or very little or much less in our understanding of well-being analysis. So my question is there any worth pricing in some idea of like intrinsic value of like freedom to keep the money that you earn?
Okay, great question. So I'm impressed by your knowledge of the literature. I think I know exactly the paper you're talking about, which is a paper by Daniel Kahneman from a couple years ago, I believe. Great. That I know the finding. That result is a lot less. He doesn't actually have data much above 80,000. He just sort of extrapolates based on what's going on right around this 80,000 point. There are the other surveys, the ones that we use when we conduct our own little WBA, they actually have data for, you know, these are general surveys of 50,000 Americans, 50,000 Britons. They have data for people ranging from, you know, the poverty line to multi-millionaires. And those data show a consistent, a slow but consistent increase in well-being as wealth goes up. And this postdoc whose research I mentioned earlier with the iPhone app, he shows the same thing. So I think Kahneman he's a little too quick to conclude that there's no effect past $80,000. There's an effect, it's just a small effect. So the greater point, you know, should we sort of protect people from having all their money taken since you know, it seems bad to do so? Well, you know, look, I mean, let's talk about the things that cost-benefit analysis and well-being analysis don't really affect. So these are both very static procedures. Cost-benefit analysis does not ask the question, you know, what will be the incentives on people's interest in working hard if we're going to take money from them or they have to pay more? You know, we're not asking that question in cost-benefit analysis. We're not really asking that question in well-being analysis either. That's a really difficult economics question that Congress gets into whenever it decides on tax policy. You know, we're not asking the question, how do people feel when they have money taken from them? You know, this is why I sort of asked what the method of taking is, right? If your marginal tax rate goes up from 35 to 39%, you know, you might feel a little bit aggrieved, but I have a hard time believing anyone is so outraged that it ruins their lives. On the other hand, if the government, you know, jackbooted thugs were to walk up to your door and say, good news, we're going to go down to your bank and we're going to liquidate your bank account and you're going to give it all to us. Like, I think that would be the kind of thing that would probably ruin people's lives and make people very upset. You know, cost-benefit analysis doesn't try to get at those sorts of questions. Well-being analysis doesn't really try to get at those sorts of questions either. But in theory, we could. You know, we could find out from people how much it affects them to be taxed at a higher rate, even aside from the money they're losing from the tax. You know, how upset are you that Congress has now raised your tax rate or something like that? I suspect that those numbers are going to be pretty small on the whole if we were actually able to isolate that effect. Really pretty small. But you know, we could find out. We could get an answer to it. I mean, I think the bottom line in this regard is just demonstrating the point that economists have understood, you know, forever about diminishing marginal utility of money. Like, every dollar is worth a lot less to you as you accumulate more and more dollars. And that makes perfect sense because, you know, the first dollar you have, you use to buy food. The second dollar you have, you use to buy shelter. You know, the third dollar you use to stay warm or whatever. And then by the time you're at the millionth dollar, it's like, boy, you know, do I want the 54-inch television or the 56-inch television? And that just doesn't have the same impact on your well-being as these other sorts of things do. So in some sense, I think this is just confirming this suspicion that economists have always had that the marginal utility of money diminishes rapidly. You know, we're just showing sort of, these data are just demonstrating how rapidly it diminishes. And, you know, that's an important finding. That's a finding that economics has been incorporating for a long time, and we're proposing to incorporate it as well, but just actually using real data about how it impacts people's lives rather than just trying to guess at it. So I believe we are out of time. Thank you all very much.